Long before the hack Bill Nye, before Beatman took over the world, the best scientist on television was Mr. Wizard. Let's go back to the 80s, and even before that, and look at Mr. Wizard's world. Welcome back to the Junk Room, everybody. It's me, the Junk Man, and I'm coming back at you with a whole new video. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about Mr. Wizard's World, or what most of us just called Mr. Wizard. Remember that show? I know what you're thinking. How can you do a video about that old television show from Nickelodeon? How are you going to make this entertaining? I don't know, but I'm going to try my best. In fact, do I ever make a video entertaining? Now, before we get started with that, I want to read this letter. I got a question on Patreon, and you can support this channel by going to patreon.com, links in the description below. But I got this letter here, printed it out, and it's a question I get asked a lot, and it's a very important question. It's based on the rant I did about the Phantom Menace, the current Star Wars movies, the Reylos, and all that. And I thought it was very important to answer this guy's question. So, let me answer his question before we get started with Mr. Wizard. The answer is, I didn't think of that. Now that I answered his question, let's talk about Mr. Wizard. You know, the guy that didn't wear this t-shirt. Man, what a sellout. I'll make a t-shirt of anything. Anyway, let's talk about Mr. Wizard. Now, most of us that's watching this video anyway, grew up on Mr. Wizard's World, television show that was on Nickelodeon. But did you know Mr. Wizard was on television way before that?
What?
Mr. Wizard's first television show was called That's Wizard, and it aired in Chicago in 1842. But his first national hit television show, called Watch Mr. Wizard, aired in 1951 until 1965, 547 episodes. Now, I wasn't alive in the 50s to watch this Mr. Wizard show, but all you OK boomers watching this probably did, if you're alive today. The thing is, even back in this show in the 50s, he looked like he was about 50 years old. This guy was always old, I think.
What?
But for this video, let's focus on the Mr. Wizard I think we all grew up on. The show was entitled Mr. Wizard's World, and it was filmed in Canada, so that could only mean one thing: that it aired on Nickelodeon. And we're talking about the golden age of Nickelodeon, the 80s. Now, I know you 90 kids are going to tell me something about Cat Dog, or Josh and Drake, or that camping show, or whatever. But no, I'm sure your 90s Nickelodeon was great, but in the 80s, Nickelodeon was awesome. The only bad thing is we didn't get Nickelodeon 24 hours a day like you spoiled kids did in the 90s. And then at night, Nickelodeon would go away and A&E would come on. And then sometime, I guess, in the late 80s, early 90s, Nickelodeon went away and Nick at Night came on. And you got to watch some classic television like the Dick Van Dyke Show. And I would ask myself, what is a Dick Van Dyke? It sounded pretty dirty to a teenage boy in the late 80s. Anyway, let's get back to Mr. Wizard and Nickelodeon. This was the golden age of Nickelodeon. Not only did we have Mr. Wizard's World, we had things like You Can't Do That on Television, Out of Control. We even had a talk show aimed at kids called Livewire. Do you remember that one? It was a big hit, but I don't really hear people talk about it today. We even had a television show starring Leonard Nimoy called Lights, Camera, Action, where they would take you behind the scenes of movies being made. I remember one time we went to the set of Return of the Jedi. Then there was that show, What Will They Think of Next? I mean, I can sit here all day and talk about Nickelodeon shows in the golden age of the 80s, but we're not going to be talking about that. I've already done a video about You Can't Do That on Television, so let's go to another one and talk about Mr. Wizard's World. It premiered on Nickelodeon in 1983, and believe it or not, it ran until 1990. Can you believe that? Seinfeld was on the air the same time Mr. Wizard was on.
What?
If you asked me before I made this video, I would have thought maybe Mr. Wizard's World went off maybe 85, 87 at the most. When I think of this show, I think of the early 80s. I sure wasn't watching it by the late 80s and not 1990. He had to be 120 by then. But yes, it lasted until 1990, 6 seasons, 78 episodes. And I love this show. You always could get some cool experiments to do at your house. The problem was, we didn't have TiVo. Well, I guess we don't have TiVo. Does anybody have TiVo anymore? We couldn't pause the television. We couldn't run back live television. Sure, we had VHS, but most of us didn't record stuff while we watched it. It was just too much trouble. So when Mr. Wizard came on with his experiment, do this at home, you had to listen very well and write really fast, because he would tell you what you needed to do your home experiment, and you couldn't run it back. You have to wait maybe 6 months for the episode to air again if you got lucky to see it at all. So a lot of times he would tell you how to do these experiments, and you would miss a couple steps, so the experiment never worked, and all you did was made a big mess in your mom's kitchen until she hit you upside the head with a broomstick and you had to clean it up. But it was a great show. I always loved these little home experiments that Mr. Wizard could do. It looked like a lot of fun. But now, as an adult looking back at Mr. Wizard, I kind of see the show a little different than I did as a kid. Because I watched some of these on YouTube, and I haven't seen this show since the 80s. And it's very strange looking back now. I guess it's just a different time. One thing I never noticed before was how ugly the kids were. Maybe they just have that 80s look. But a lot of these kids are really ugly nerds. And a lot of them say a boot. Now, I'm not going to lie and act like I was some rock star beautiful creature. I mean, look at this. So when I say these were ugly nerds, I'm counting myself in that group also. So don't get offended if you're one of those kids that was on Mr. Wizard's World. You know, if they made this show today, they would have child models on the show. It would be an 8-year-old that looked like he just stepped out of a Sears catalog. But not these kids. Maybe it was because they were from Canada. Maybe the kids just looked a little more goofy up there. You don't believe me? You don't believe these kids look kind of goofy, even for the 80s? I'll prove it.
Nope, you can do it.
I don't know.
Right. And then, or the bubbles will go in your nose.
Right.
And
He said he's incapable of making a mistake.
yeah.
There, it's popped off.
Oh,
Wow, hit you right on the head, too.
Other than having the coolest clothes I've ever seen, those are some nerdy looking kids. But then again, they're hanging out with an 80-year-old scientist. So I guess they are going to be kind of nerdy. And that's another thing that I didn't really think about as a kid when I watched this in the 80s. Where were these kids' parents? They were always hanging out at his old man's house alone. And it was never a group of kids with the old man. It was always just him in his kitchen or in his living room with one kid. I mean, you have to admit, it's kind of creepy. They didn't even try to make this look like a film studio or anything. It looks like they're in his kitchen. They're alone with Mr. Wizard. And you don't really realize how creepy that is till you go back and watch it as an adult.
Run this up and down 10 times. And what do you think you're doing with it? The important thing is that you get a piece of wood that just slips inside like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, wait till I'm through with you. You'll be sorry you said what you said. Do you mind if I do the acid? Come on inside to my workshop and I'll show you. We're very good at dropping balls. If you handle it, which I'm going to ask you to do in a moment, you use these tongs. You check it with your finger, Tana, see if it's hard. Well, you know, some parts of your body are more sensitive to touch than others.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with the beginning.
That's how much I have to blow?
Well, you don't have to blow that much. Give me a hug. You're a great tease. Over and out.
I don't know about you, but I wouldn't leave my kid alone with Don Herbert. But I'm sure Mr. Wizard was a great guy. I'm just saying, it's kind of creepy now going back to look at it, why he was always hanging out with one kid all the time. And in fact, I remember an episode where he took a kid out in the middle of nowhere and left him there alone. Not only do I find it now creepy that he hung out with kids alone, there's something else I never really noticed until I started watching some clips on YouTube. Mr. Wizard was a jerk. Listen how he talks to kids. He just seems so condescending sometimes. Check it out.
Look at all the paper you wasted. Why isn't it random? I told you to write down random numbers. Sounds logical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's wrong.
S.
You don't have to say anything. The computer is saying them for you.
Okay.
Haven't you ever seen a sliced banana before? You can't blow up a baby's nursing nipple? Hot wax drop on your finger?
Yeah.
Well, hold it straight up, then it won't do that. And I must say, I don't think it looks any better than mine.
See, you're not going to be able to watch Mr. Wizard the same way again, are you? If you even was going to ever watch it again. But overall, making fun of Mr. Wizard, but it was a great show. I loved it as a kid. Like I said, I got to see a lot of cool experiments that you could do at home. I always liked finding out cool little experiments you could do in your own home. Like that time he told me 101 things you can do with dog feces. That was a great episode. So although it's a little creepy going back and watching it now, growing up, I loved Mr. Wizard's World. And I loved Nickelodeon. I mean, pinwheel spinning around. Look at my pinwheel. Look what I found. I hated pinwheel, but I still to this day can recite that at any given moment. You can walk up to me anytime and say pinwheel. And I'll say pinwheel spinning around. Look at my pinwheel. Look what I found. And I'm not even going to get into that Creepy Today special where that mannequin comes alive. Whew, that one still scared me because of that old security guard puppet. Okay, I'm ranting away now. Anyway, this video is probably not going to do real good. I'm not sure how many people out there care about Mr. Wizard, but somehow I was on YouTube and I just ended up in Mr. Wizard's hole. I mean, a rabbit hole of Mr. Wizard videos. Not in his hole. But tell me what you think. Did you watch Mr. Wizard's World? Maybe you grew up on the original Mr. Wizard. Let me know all this in the comments what you think about Mr. Wizard's World. And if you never watched it, just seeing these clips here, what's your take on it? Do they seem kind of like a jerk?
What?
Anyway, thank you for watching. As always, please share this video so more people can find the channel and we can all have a great, fun community here. And, as always, subscribe to the channel and thumb up the video. And I'll be back again very soon with a new video.
Come on, I'll show you.
Help!
Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.